This is the Almost Awakened Podcast, a no-nonsense approach to spirituality with your hosts, Brittany Hartley and Bill Reel. Here we dive deep into the wisdom traditions while acknowledging insightful breakthroughs in science, psychology, and human development. Our goal is to explore the good life and the very best of spirituality, no nonsense required. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources we shared. And now, today's podcast episode.
Brittany Hartley, how are you?
Good. How are you, Bill? Happy anniversary.
Look at that. 25 years. Me and my wife have been together. I still love her dearly, and we feel like we're still rocking and rolling.
She wrote a little sweet thing about you this morning that was really nice.
But
nice? I have bad news. You guys are going on a trip together, but the bad news is that there's 6 major planets in retrograde right now. So whatever you have planned is just going to go to hell.
Is Mars one of them?
I don't know. All I know is I follow a few, tarot kind of horoscope people because I always just want to see what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're all going crazy, right? And that this is just, your life is just going to fall apart and the planets and all of that. So that is happening right now. So I just wanted to give you fair warning.
I believe it. I just turned 44. My body is in retrograde, so I would assume the planets would be as well. Everything's deteriorating.
Yeah. It's interesting how that would be such a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I've seen posts that are like, things are just going to go really awry in the next week. And so just really just watch out for it and be aware that it's coming. And I feel like if you enter your week thinking things are just going to really go amiss, I mean, that pattern is going to show up somewhere, Yeah. Anyway, watch out, my friend.
Okay. I'll try to be extra careful during this trip.
Okay. But this week we have an awesome episode. There are some times where, as Bill and I are preparing for an episode, we'll send each other articles, we'll send each other podcasts to try to make sure that we have a good understanding of the topic that we're talking about. But this one, I mean, I haven't seen anyone do a podcast and put together the numbers like we did this week. And so what we're really going to do is talk about Gen Z spirituality. And the reason that we want to talk about this is if we want to get a sense of where religion is going, and this is what I did my master's degree on, because I wanted to know, okay, people are deconstructing. Where is this going? Nobody has any idea. And I think one answer to that, as far as where is it going, is what are the kids doing, right? Because as the older generations die, what are the kids doing for spirituality? Where are they going as their parents are deconstructing, as institutions are deconstructing? And so this week, we're just going to pull up a bunch of surveys and numbers and really get a sense for what kind of this age group is doing as far as religion and spirituality, what's happening in the world of religion and spirituality, so we can see where this is going. We talk a lot about deconstruction on this podcast and reconstruction, but we're kind of putting it together into a bigger movement than just, you and me and the people listening. So
yeah, we should get a chance through this data to really get a feel of how the younger generation is separating themselves from their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. Yeah. And I think most of it, as we'll see, I think most of it is good. I think there's some negative here too that I hope we get a chance to kind of jump into.
Yeah, they have their own strengths and they have their own challenges. I think what's interesting is because the internet was such an explosive thing, the difference between this generation and their parents and grandparents is just a wider divide than any other generation in history, right? And so it's really, if you want to know where religion and spirituality is going, let's look to see what these kids are doing. And you have more experience with these guys than I do. You have kids who are in this age group. And I really don't. I didn't know this till today. The generation after Gen Z is Generation Alpha, which would be more my kids. But you can tell me about what these kids are doing. I have no idea.
Generation Alpha. Okay.
So it starts over. All right. So first of all, who is Gen Z? We can bring this up here. Gen Z is anyone born from Gen X is anyone born from 1965 to 1980. So you'd be Gen X, right,
Hmm.
Bill?
Yeah.
Baby boomers 1946 to 1964, millennials 1981 to 1996. So I'm an old millennial. And then Generation Z is 1997 to 2012, would be where Gen Z falls under. And the interesting thing about this generation is that they're sexually fluid more so than any other generation, racially diverse. It's a large part of the population. One thing that's really interesting about them is that they're biblically illiterate. Some of it is just the language of the King James version of the Bible, and them being on the internet so much and texting and all that, but they really, as a generation, have no idea really what's in the Bible, don't have a biblical worldview, don't get involved in theological debates, don't really understand what the atonement is or what it does or why it's needed. They just don't get any of that, it seems. And then something unique to them is that their dreams are to become financially independent, follow their dreams, enjoy life and travel, and learn who they are. And that's a really big one. They really want, there's so much pressure in social media, and they want to figure out, who am I? What is my brand? That's a really important thing for them. Whereas if you ask the boomer generation, they would say something like, I want to start a meaningful or a good career. I want to start a family. We're not seeing that as high priorities for Gen Z. They really want to travel and find some way to have financial security and and really know who they are.
The only thing I would add to this little, this kind of introduction is every generation has their challenges. Generations in the past have had to deal with major world wars, economic collapses. My grandfather, who's passed away now, was at the tail end kind of the being born in the Great Depression. And that affects people. So the things that people deal with and parenting styles differ from generation to generation. So parents that came out of World War II raised their kids different than my parents, who, for the most part, other than a few hiccups with things like Vietnam and stuff, had a really smooth kind of non-traumatic events going on in the world. And I think all of that plays a role in how a person grows up and what shapes their worldview. And so it's not just something like, oh, the internet's here and it's safe to deconstruct religion. There's a lot more that goes into these ideas than just that.
Yeah, another interesting thing, and if you want to bring up slide 2, Bill, another interesting thing is that, as you talked about, what are the big life events of that generation? And World War II, obviously these parents, these dads especially, came back very traumatized from that, and that trickles down. But for this generation, it's so interesting that their parents were afraid of the godless communists. That was kind of their thing, the Cold War. But then this generation, talking about 9/11. 9/11 is the big historical event of my generation, but also kind of the generation after. And that's a different kind of enemy. They're not godless atheist communists, they're religious fundamentalists. And that affected them in a different way than like the Cold War kind of did for previous generations. So obviously the big thing about Generation Z is the internet. Most of them use their phones for more than 4 hours a day. Most of them have it on them 100% of their day. And it really changed this generation very quickly. So because they just, in one day, they can see thousands of stories and perspectives, more so than any other human person in history. They are the most racially, religiously, sexually diverse generation in history. And they understand that people have different beliefs and perspectives and experiences, and they have a huge appreciation for social inclusiveness. That's their thing, right? And sometimes we call them, snowflakes for it, but it comes from this idea that they see through the internet that there's a lot of different ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, they're just to say here, and I don't need to necessarily add something at every point, but in terms of the things that awaken people, anytime you get exposure to a larger world than the lens you see through. So folks who read lots of books, folks who travel a lot and expose themselves to different environments, different geographies. I'm trying to think offhand. Folks who use psychedelic drugs, that's another one. So anytime you either alter your consciousness or experience a worldview that isn't natural to you, you tend to be prone to become more inclusive, more diverse in the ways that you just mentioned. And I think that's at least of note. Like there are certain tricks to get there.
Hmm. Yeah, travel, and when you're online, you're really you're able to
Yeah.
travel all the time, right? And none of our grandparents and our great grandparents, they lived in one area with one kind of community, and they would make a trip once in a while and have a little bit of a culture shock and maybe bring that back, but not in the sense of every day hearing someone's story on the internet multiple times from all over the world, and they just think that that is normal, and it really changed this generation in such a drastic way. So another
Yeah.
thing that's interesting is that the family is not important to the sense of self. So they admire their parents, obviously, like they still need their parents, but more than half of Gen Z says that, and still more than half of Gen Z says that their parents are their primary role model, but it's not necessary for their sense of self. They don't need their family to help them create their identity in the world, which is super interesting. That's a major departure from other generations.
Right. They sort of had catalysts that help them individuate without really needing what past generations have had, which is either significant time or sometimes never to individuate at all.
Right. So if you were growing up, and I'm Jewish because my family's Jewish and my grandparents are Jewish, and that gave kids an instant, this is who I am because this is the tribe around me. Because Gen Z sees that kind of everyone is different and everyone has different perspectives, they just don't need their family as much to create their identity. They are
Mm.
in much earlier in life having to create their own identity, and as you're saying, individuating much earlier than any of us really did. Usually we didn't see that until late adulthood, when you start to kind of break away from your parents. I mean, they're doing that much younger.
Yeah. I've got a 16-year-old who, let's see here. I'm trying to think offhand if he falls. I think he's after this whole thing. Nope, he would be that, right? He'd be that generation,
Mhm.
Gen Z. So my 16-year-old is kind of just beats to the tune of his own drum. He doesn't care what, the kids in school say, mom and dad. It really doesn't matter what we say. He's going to kind of do his own thing. And he's a good kid. He makes good choices. But I've had a lot less influence on him than I did my other three.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember when I was first going through my faith crisis back when we first met, over a decade ago. And it was so interesting that I really thought, like, I think I'm the only Mormon. I had this thought, I think I'm the only Mormon, or I'm the only person going to church who doesn't believe it, but I still kind of want to go because I have some benefits or whatever. And because there wasn't like online groups where I realized that other people had this experience, I really thought I must be the only one in the whole world. It's such a
Mm.
it's almost a vain thought. I must be the only one in the whole world who kind of looks at religious history, and I see that it's not true, but I see the psychological benefits. And without finding people online, I found online, other people I find online, I really wouldn't have ever been able to find my people and felt like, oh, I'm not the only one who experiences religion that way. And so I think that's part of it. It's much easier to find your niche because you can go to any Reddit subgroup, whatever, and find your people who are interested in the same weird thing that you're interested in. And that took a long time. I mean, that took a long time before the internet to try to curate those people around you and find those people. So I think that's part of it. You're safer to individuate also because you can kind of curate these groups online of, oh, these people are like me. It's okay to be like me.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not isolated. You're not by yourself. You're not alone. You're not the only person in your city that you know of that has a leaning towards this or that. Like there's other people that are very easy to find. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a wide variety of friends. This one is different. Boomer, like the boomer generation, it's hard for them to even understand this. So almost half of Gen Z are friends with someone who are vastly different from them, like really, really different upbringing, and like friends with them, like good friends with them, as opposed to their grandparents. Our grandparents rarely had to rub elbows with people who had really significantly different life experiences, like sitting down your grandparent and sitting them down next to someone who is trans or something and have them listen to their story. There was just no way for those two people to sit with each other and hear each other's stories and be friends. Like that just never really happened. And so they never had some of the cognitive dissonance or pushback to their own beliefs because they never bumped into people who were significantly different than them. And so they have just an access to a wide variety of human experience, more so than kind of our grandparents' generation can really understand.
Don't you think this is going to be a huge one in terms of how these kids parent the next generation and the generation after? That once these kids have had all of this exposure and interaction with people who are very different from them, I can't help but think that another generation or two, and you end up with so much more inclusivity, acceptance of people living out their life in their own way. Racial equality, gender equality, all of those things I think are going to be deeply impacted by this generation becoming parents.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it comes with its own set of problems too, as all things do. When you have this huge encouragement to be accepting of everything and be inclusive of everything, I think it would be really hard to parent from that place,
Mm.
as a Gen Z parent, because how do you stand up for, against things that are wrong, that would be, or morally wrong, or makes any lines in the sand. Making lines in the sand of saying, we're going to say that this is not okay, is very difficult when you want to be inclusive of everything, right?
Mhm.
And so we talk about this sometimes politically, that the left will has this huge message of being inclusive and liberal values and values for women, and they never want to say anything against something like Islam, or like fundamentalist Islam, or women and their clothing, because they want to accept that these are some people's point of view. But the actual science shows that, when women feel the pressure to dress in a certain way, even if that's their choice, you can see that it gets really tricky there. And then how do you even say, I don't think this is right, when you try to be accepting of everything? I think that's where it gets really tricky for Gen Z.
Love it.
So their issues. I'm curious to see if this shows up in your kids. So high anxiety. So underneath this expansive worldview is a ton of insecurity. So there's pressure to find themselves as people, especially like kind of their brand and what their thing is, social media presence, become financially successful. Obviously, the world has changed enough that they can't just go to college and get a job and have these like perfectly made paths that some of our grandparents had. It's a little bit more tricky. And then, there's 9/11, there's a recession, the teens are anxious about their future. Um, and then also just this deep insecurity. So there's multiple reasons for this. So beneath kind of this online veneer of happiness, we're showing that Generation Z experiences more loneliness, more anxiety, and more stress than any other generation. So I think we'll get to this statistic later, but I think it's something like 78% of Gen Z feels anxious and lonely and disconnected and stressed out. So, the world is deconstructing, institutions are deconstructing. How do I get a job? How do I find out who I am? there's no mentors for Gen Z. If their parents have left organized religion, there's really no ability for teens to be around adult mentors that kind of keep their eye on them and give them good advice and that they can talk to. The institutions that used to provide that are kind of crumbling, right? And so we just have a ton of anxiety that lies under the surface. So the pressure of matching their real life to what others post online, especially body image issues for young women, they're just insecure young brains seeking for identity, seeking for structure, and finding just a world of complexity. And it gives them a ton of anxiety.
Yeah, so I've got one of my 4 kids who feels a lot of that, and then 2 of the leftover 3 have a higher degree of anxiety than I had growing up. I wouldn't call it debilitating or severe, but it's certainly increased over what I felt. And another thing, just maybe to think about in this particular section, is that they live in a world now where you can really have your life messed up from people very far away. So it can be something as small as like identity theft or cyber attacks, things like that, right? But then you also live in a world now where a country on the other side of the globe can push a red button and send nuclear bombs, right? And I think people are all aware that there's only so much of that the planet could take. And so we all live kind of recognizing that things are way more fragile. When I was young, the world felt really safe to me. And I think our kids are very aware, having watched the storming on the Capitol, having watched accusations of election fraud, knowing Russia's attacking Ukraine and knowing that Russia keeps threatening to nuke people. I think we live in a world now that folks realize that things could go south in the snap of a finger.
Yeah, I do get, I had the same experience where growing up, it felt like the world was stable, right? It felt like, other than 9/11, which obviously shattered some of that veneer, but it felt like the world wasn't gonna like topple tomorrow. And something with the social media and especially kind of the news, the way that it is today, it does feel every day like we are on the brink. And I've met kids, I actually had a client who was a teenager. It was one of my few teenagers that I actually got to work with, who was struggling at school because she had this sense, and I don't think you and I had the same sense as teenagers. She had this sense that the, with climate change, that the world is ending, and that these little games with trying to get good grades for colleges, for jobs that won't even exist by the time I get there, what is even the point? And so she couldn't apply herself at school because she genuinely felt like we are on the edge of economic and nature and societal collapse. And she just felt that every day. And like, there are a lot of kids who really are taking on that level of existential angst much, much earlier than any of us did.
Yeah, completely. Again, I see some of that as well.
All right, so the next slide here. So Generation Z and religion. Gen Z is leaving organized religion. A variety of studies report 50 to 70% of young Christians walk away from the church by the time that they're in college. And then 79% of young people say that when they did stop believing, it was during their teen years. So they still go to church with their parents if their parents go to church. But by the time that they're in college, most of them stop attending. And when you ask them, when did you actually stop believing? They'll say it was much earlier. They'll say it was when they were a teenager, but then sometimes they continued to attend with their parents until they turned 18 and then they stopped. So they are kind of the majority of them. And we're going to be specifically talking about Christianity because we're just talking about America here. Gen Z in different countries will have different experiences. But in America, they're just not going to, and that number is increasing. They're not coming back to the pews. So whatever churches are doing, it has to be different than the way that it's done before. And churches are just scrambling to figure out, how do we get these kids to come back?
What do you think? So obviously access to information and exposure to different people. So religion is often imposing a worldview that makes us's and them's. And these kids just have too much exposure to diversity in 1,000 different ways to just swallow that hook, line, and sinker. But it does seem as though there may be something else to this. And I don't know what it is. Maybe we can flesh it out, but it feels as though younger folks feel a whole lot safer bucking the trends of their parents and grandparents than my generation or my parents' generation would have been. And I don't know quite what that is, or I don't know if I can put my finger on it, but and maybe parenting style too. Like maybe my generation as parents allowed the younger generation a safer space to do something, right? To do something different, to have a different view, to believe in some other way.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about our grandparents' generation, if you were in a Catholic group and you
Mm,
lived, doesn't even matter, okay? You lived somewhere, everyone in the community went to church on Sunday, right? There was really how you're going to get a job and your family name. I mean, that is how you're going to make it in the world, right? And so, even though some people may not have believed then, everybody just went anyway, right? Because leaving that community meant that you were totally kind of lost in the world, you know? Whereas these kids, because they see the world and then because they see, if I'm not Catholic, I see 1,000 Catholics or non-Catholics every day,
yeah.
leading, fulfilling, flourishing lives. Maybe if I leave this safe space, I'm not going to die. And I don't
Mm,
think our grandparents and great grandparents, I don't think they had the opportunity to see that, because really the reality was, if you leave this town, you're leaving with no resources, no tools, no people know you, totally vulnerable to, if you got sick or whatever. And so you just kind of stay with what is, because the entire structure is built around, we all go to church at this time. But because I think that they see that there's so many other ways to flourish as a human that are not dependent on this one particular way, I think they just have more permission to say, if I don't do this, I'm not going to die. Right? I can
yeah.
leave this tribe and I'm not going to die. And I think the other thing that's interesting, and we'll get to this statistic later, is that some people think, oh, they're leaving church, they're becoming godless atheists. And although that number is rising, on the whole, the answer is no, they're not. They still mostly believe in God. And the very interesting statistic is that they still mostly believe that Jesus was a real person and probably was raised from the dead. And so when we talk about leaving the church, this isn't that they're having at 16 this complex, I'm an atheist because I've done 20 years of biblical study and I think that Jesus was a historical person, but I don't think that like, it's not that complex yet, right?
Mm-mm.
They're 16. It can't be, right? They just haven't studied enough. And so they still believe, overall, more than 50%, believe in God, believe in Jesus. But the really interesting statistic is that 60% of Gen Zs who report themselves as Christian report that they find God more outside of the church. And so
Mm.
leaving the church doesn't mean I did this kind of, long biblical deconstruction. Leaving the church often for these kids is, I still believe in God, I still want spirituality, but I'm not getting it here. And that is the interesting statistic to me for what this
Yeah.
generation's doing. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems as though, and again, this will play out in other slides as well, but it seems as though there's this developing distrust in institutions, this developing distrust in systems. And this is a generation that realizes that its government to some degree spies on us, right? Like there was the WikiLeaks docs that came out that showed that smart TVs with cameras, like actually in the documents, it says like, yeah, the government has access to watch you. And so I think they do have a level of distrust. They sense that not everybody's on the same team that they said they were on, and that privacy and rights may be a little more fragile than I thought in the 1980s.
Yeah. And churches used to be able to hide, and some of them still have the um, kind of pattern of, if we can actually hide this so that nobody finds out about it, so that the church is still kind of the center of the community. But with the internet, the kids know, about sexual abuse in churches and institutions. Like they know about it. You can't hide it from them.
Do you know any churches that hide things?
Not any.
Okay.
Wow, not any. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned this before, but the interesting thing is that with each generation, there's a decline in the biblical worldview, meaning what's happening in the world is, the Bible has kind of all of this mapped out. This is what happened, and Jesus is coming, and the whole story. So it's 4% of Gen Z have a biblical worldview, and it's said in the study, and I'm using this Barna group, which is a big study that they did on Gen Z spirituality and religion, and they published a book with all these findings. So if you're super interested in that, it's all contained in a book that I actually went through in my program. But in the results, it said they sense the absurdity of that view and they don't give it the time of day. So what's interesting is that older generations can get into debates about, is God an interventionist God? Or what are the hoops to jump through towards salvation? How should baptism be? Should it be a sprinkling, or should it be immersion? And all of those debates can happen, but Gen Z is not involved in any of it. They don't get it. They don't know the basics of Christian theology. They don't really understand what the cross is all about. And so you'll get a lot of books that'll talk about from various churches or theologians that will talk about, if we can just get Generation Z to understand all this theology and all this theological history, then they'll stay, then they'll be. And the truth is, they're just not interested. That's not going to be their hook. They don't get it. They don't want to read the King James version of the Bible. It just doesn't resonate with them at all. And so what does Christianity do when you have 2,000 years of interesting and complex ideas of Christian theology and this whole history, and you have an entire generation that just does not care about it? I just don't care about it.
Yeah.
What do
And
they
I think
do?
and I think to some degree, my parents' generation had, to some degree, religion kind of shoved down their throat. And I think they maybe started to develop kind of an aversion to that. And little by little, here we go. It just softens up generation after generation. It'd be interesting to go back even another generation or two and see what that number would have been, because I imagine the degree upward would have been a little more significant, maybe 18 to 25% or so. Once you go back another generation or two.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fight, it's been said that the fight against a biblical worldview and a scientific worldview, that the biblical worldview is losing quite a bit of ground and loses more ground every year. And so something interesting that I wanted to bring up later, but I was listening to Daniel Dennett this morning, one of the 4 horsemen of New Atheism, and he talked about how religion has changed more in the past 100 years than the 2,000 years before that, because we have such scientific information. In our lifetime, we've seen Christianity be extremely resistant to evolution, to basically being forced to accept it. That has never happened. In the past, when you're talking about the numbers before boomers, Christianity never had to do anything. They could do whatever they wanted. It was just reality. It was just embedded in the system. This is reality. And you could kill scientists if you wanted to, and that kind of thing. But in our generation, in our lifetime, we've seen evolution being extremely resisted to. Theologians now saying this is how God, they have different ways of explaining how God uses evolution and the Bible's still true or whatever. But those big shifts they've never had to do before, and they're having to do it on multiple fronts. And so the prediction right now is that religion is going to change more in the next 20 years than it has had to even in the past 100 years or the 2,000 years before that. So the next 20 years, just because of the explosion of information, churches will have to adjust and change more than any other time that they've had to. And you sense that churches are trying to figure out, how do we stay relevant, right? Because people are leaving. How do we stay relevant? And so I think that's what makes this so interesting, is because we're watching that churches are going to have to change, but nobody really knows where that's going, which makes this such an exciting field for me.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, right? Another generation or two, and see how well Christianity and religion generally is faring. And I don't think it's going to be better than today. I think it's going to be even worse.
I think that's one exciting thing about this podcast, is that if we were doing a podcast on, I don't know, some time in Christian history, eventually you'd kind of run out of material. Like, you've gone over the people, you've gone over all the ideas. But I think what enables us to hopefully be able to continue this podcast is that if in the next 20 years, religion is going to change more than any 1,000-year period of history in the past, then we're going to be able to watch that journey, right? We're going to be able to see where it goes and be a part of those conversations. So that's a personal plug. That's why this is so exciting to me and why I wanted to dig into this. All right, so the next slide here, and if you're listening to this in podcast form and you want to see these, you can, hop onto our YouTube channel and be able to see these links that we're talking about, is why they leave, right? So researchers have been asking young ex-Christians specifically why they leave the church, and their answers are interesting. And so here are the most popular responses based on 4 different studies. There are too many questions that can't be answered. I believe in science and not miracles. I realized the story was like Santa or the Easter Bunny. I have a hard time believing that God would allow so much evil or suffering in the world. I had a bad experience at church. I don't see women, people of color, and LGBT people treated kindly at church, and the church is not relevant to me personally. So 59% of Gen Z says the church is not relevant to me. And then 61% of Christians, so those who self-identify as I am Christian, I believe in God, I even still believe in Jesus, say that they find God elsewhere. They're finding God outside the church. So I think that was one of the most interesting statistics, is that the majority of Christian Gen Z are really finding God outside the pews. And so 60% of Gen Z youth believe that Jesus was a real person who was actually raised from the dead. 70% of Gen Z believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And that is surprising, considering that only 25% believe that the Bible is accurate in all of the principles it teaches. So isn't that interesting? So we have 4% of Gen Z that believe that, the biblical worldview. We have about a quarter saying that they believe that the Bible is accurate. So pretty low. But then 60-70% still believe in God and Jesus. They haven't replaced it with anything. They're just not finding God and Jesus at church.
Yeah, it would be, well, I don't know what the right word is. It would be expected that these two things would go line in line, right? Like they would be backing away from the church and losing belief, which tells you that the church really has an opportunity here, right? Because it sounds like and looks like these kids still want to, at least right now, or they believe in it and they want to participate, but that's not where they're getting their bucket filled. It's not interesting. When I read the answers that are on the screen right now, church is not relevant to me personally. I find God elsewhere. I can teach myself what I need to know. The rituals are empty. I don't like the people who are there. I think church is out of date. They're basically saying, I'm bored. This isn't interesting. It's not filling my bucket. It's not giving me anything to go out into the real world and to feel more capable.
It's like this huge surge of this population who's spiritually homeless, and all the churches are trying to figure out how do we provide shelter? How do we provide the place where all of these essentially spiritually homeless people are going to go? And nobody's quite figured it out as far as institutional churches, but you're right. There is an opportunity, because people think that if you leave church, oh, you're just, a godless atheist. You have no path. You have no beliefs. You've lost your beliefs. And the statistics are saying that's not true. They still believe in God. They're trying to find God. And so if they do, there may be, a flocking to some particular something, but they're just not finding God at church and they still believe in God.
Yeah. Notice too, we noted that this generation has more anxiety, and notice that often the mechanisms of religion, at least in the past up until now, have been things of shame and guilt. And I don't think these kids are going to tolerate that. They can already sense that they're anxious. They can already sense that they're dealing with some negative emotions that maybe their parents didn't deal with. And I don't think more shame and guilt is the solution. The church is going to have to figure, and I think the secret here, the church is going to have to figure out a way that it lets go of the BS that is demonstrably BS in the eyes of these kids. Like, they've got access to the internet, they can go on their phone and they can find historical data points and conversations from really intelligent people in just a couple of seconds. So the church is going to have to let go of the BS and figure out a way to go, look, we're just going to have to talk to you straight. Here's why religion and ritual and all these things are important. And as you and I both know, they may not be able to do that. There may be too much institutional ego to admit that science and the progress of the world was always ahead of the church anyway.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point that I didn't think of, is that this generation, if you threaten that they're going to go to hell, it just doesn't even land, right?
Yeah, and it might even be too overwhelming. Like, come on, I already have enough anxiety about the things in day to day. I don't want to deal with
I
that.
have anxiety about who I am and if there's even going to be a planet tomorrow. Your little
Yeah.
threats about whatever hell you believe in, it's not, you can't use that tool anymore. That's an old tool that's gone out of
Right.
date. I didn't even think about that at all. That's super interesting. All right, so next slide here. So then the rise of, so non-Christians. So that was kind of the Christian Gen Z. And so non-Christians barriers to faith. So when you ask Gen Z who do not identify as Christian, why wouldn't you go to church? Why wouldn't you go to a Christian church? Why wouldn't you join religion? They say, I have a hard time believing, again, that a good God would allow evil and suffering. So the problem of evil. Christians are hypocrites, which is interesting. I believe science refutes too much of the Bible. I don't believe in fairy tales. There are too many injustices in the history of Christianity. That's interesting.
Right. Why are they a moral authority? Like, why do you set yourself up as a moral authority when you've screwed people over for 2,000 years?
Yes. And you can't hide it anymore, and you can't whitewash the history anymore, and you can't threaten me with hell anymore. It's just there. The reality is there, right? I used to go to church, but it's just not important to me anymore. And then I had a bad experience at church with a Christian. So those were in order. So the highest one is that I just can't believe that there's a good God, the good God that Christians believe in, with this much evil and suffering. And I mean, they can go where our grandparents were never able to go. I mean, they can turn on the TV and watch a movie about the slums of India. That's powerful. Like, most of our generation never got to really have those kinds of experiences, and they have to face that again much earlier in life. And they just don't believe in this Christian, loving, all-powerful God because of what they're seeing in the reality of the world.
Yeah, the institutional church isn't meeting both groups' expectations, and hence it is less or unuseful. Less useful or unuseful.
All right, so this chart that I'm showing is a little bit more complex, but there's two really, really interesting lines here. So this is the rise of the nuns, meaning that when you're asked about, what religion are you, they would just circle none. And so American religion overall is experiencing kind of its flock away from the pews. In 1986, 10% of young adults gave the answer none when responding to a survey about religious affiliation. But by 2016, that figure had shot up to 40%. And when you're talking about, 30 points just in 20, 30 years, I mean, that's a huge, huge shift really fast in, when you're talking about human statistics. And so that number is actually rising. So now we're in 2022, it's been another 5 years, and that figure is closer to 50%. And so for the first time in American history, Protestant Christianity does not represent the majority of Americans. And so, as recently as 2009, that shift happened where we are no longer a majority Christian nation. And if you are a Christian, that's going to feel really threatening. I understand that that would feel really threatening. I heard a really interesting analogy that how would you react if, aliens came to the planet and all of a sudden all the kids started to really want to do alien culture, whatever it is, and they stopped playing baseball and they stopped playing piano and they stopped doing all the humans things that we do and they just started doing alien things. That would feel really threatening. That would feel like, but we've played baseball in our family for 100 years. We watch it every Sunday. This is our way of life, right? And that same threat is how Christian religion feels right now, is that the kids are doing things that, we just don't even recognize anymore, but we've played baseball for forever. It is a good way of life. It is a beautiful thing. And so you can see why they're feeling very threatened at this time, because of course their way of life is now no longer the majority in America. And so it's interesting that not all nuns are atheists. So 13% of Gen Z identify as atheists. That's really high for atheism, but it's not by any means a majority, right? So 4% of boomers were identified as atheists. So that number tripled, but it's still a minority of atheism.
Just the only thing here, I noticed like Catholic and evangelical seem to have like these opposite trajectories in the early 90s. And most of these, they're losing ground pretty slow. But I don't know what they mean exactly by mainline Christianity. I was looking it up as you were sharing your last set of thoughts. It says here, mainline Protestant churches are a group of Protestant denominations in the United States, that differ in contrast in history and practice with evangelical fundamentalists or charismatic. So they're not those ones; they're the others. And the ones they listed were like the American Baptist, Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it seems like much more of like the softer Christian faiths, right?
Yeah. So
and they've
Baptist,
lost a lot of ground.
Yeah, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, those kinds had the drop, and then the nuns kind of took all those numbers.
Yeah.
And then evangelical is, there's a fade, especially as evangelical Christianity really got involved into politics. And we know that Gen Z does not like this. They know that Gen Z is not a fan of kind of the gun Jesus, like, the Second Amendment Jesus, like that whole mix. They're just not buying this evangelical political Jesus, right? It's a very unique kind of Jesus. It's very different than, the social justice leftist version of Jesus. These are two really, really different people. The right's version of Jesus and the left. But they're still very powerful in America. They still have numbers in America. But the Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, that kind of Christianity, just huge decline, and an uptick in atheists and an uptick really in nuns, that I'm spiritual. I still believe in God. More than half of Americans still believe in God, but I don't identify with a specific religion. That's what's happening.
Every single line there is losing ground to one degree or another, and the nuns are picking up all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another interesting thing on this map is that the one that stays the most steady is the Jews. And that's because you can be a secular Jew, you can always claim that you're a Jew. Because if you say I'm a Jew, that could mean that I'm ethically Jewish. That could mean that I'm Orthodox Jewish. That could mean I'm an atheist, but I'm Jewish. And so what Judaism has been able to do, and we can talk about this too, is that religions usually do one of two things when they're really threatened. They either become super, super Orthodox, and the identity markers go up as far as who's in and who's out, and a lot of obedience narratives, and this is the line, and the world is evil, but stay here, that kind of stuff. You can go that route, or you can shift. And so what Judaism has done, and the reason that it's still alive, even though it's one of our oldest religions, is that they shifted. they've really let go of almost every truth claim that they used to hold. And so what's left really is culture, right? Judaism is much more of a culture than a truth claim kind of religion. And so it stays about the same because the culture continues year after year because people's beliefs are able to shift still within Judaism. And so that number just stays the same. And it may just stay the same because it's such a cultural thing without the pressure of having to believe this or that, which gives it some longevity. And then evangelical is still powerful because they still have that this is the way, and this kind of fear message, which still is a powerful kind of political message in America. And then we see a lot of churches declining.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of secular Methodist.
Right. Here's a question: if somehow, like tomorrow, if you could be a secular Mormon, would you go back? Like if that space was really made? If you could be a secular Mormon the way that people are a secular Jew, and you just show up to the events and you don't have to believe in anything and you just still show up to...
And they're not going to say really mean shit about me?
Yeah.
Yeah, then I don't know. I think that's almost kind of like the Community of Christ, right? Like they're really soft and easy, and I don't know. I probably not.
Interesting.
Yeah, probably not.
I do love like the cool thing about Judaism to me is that you just have this really rich liturgical calendar. So every other day is a holiday of something because they've just been around for so long. And I think I'm envious of that because I love how it's like, oh, today is Saint whatever day, and we're reminded to be grateful. Or today is the day of forgiveness, and everyone in the community will go up to each other and will forgive each other for, the spats that we've had in the past year. And so it's this kind of like rhythm of like continual story and heroes and virtues and actions. And yeah, I kind of like that. That's really cool. I've always been envious of that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could show up at the Ward Christmas party and participate in service projects, and again, their rhetoric was kind to people who deconstruct and step away.
And the bishop was an open atheist because, I mean, the amount of atheist rabbis in places like New York City, I mean, just astounding. I mean, there's tons of atheist rabbis.
Yeah, that's a crazy idea because Mormonism has no space for that. But yes, if it was soft in its rhetoric and it made room for non-believers to participate without being second-class citizens, then yeah, I maybe that would happen.
Interesting. Yeah, I've always been jealous of people who have like an atheist rabbi and then you do all the rituals because they're meaningful, but without any supernatural. They've been able to make that jump, and which is why their number stays the same.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So next slide here.
By the way, one reason for that, they're stuck using the old writings to some extent, right? Whereas Christianity gets to go like, oh, we did away with the Old Testament. Jesus fulfilled the law. And Jesus, for the most part, says pretty healthy things. And you can kind of parse out the community's rules from Jesus's teachings. And so there was kind of a way to go like, hey, whereas the Jewish people have their set of laws, commandments, historical documents, and it probably is easier in that older tradition to go like, oh, that doesn't make sense with my modern worldview. Whereas Christianity can kind of dispose of the Old Testament where it needs to and claim that Jesus has given them something different. And so maybe it's not as stark of a difference.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the tough thing with Jesus is that we all each church claims such a different Jesus, and then if your Jesus is leading that church, then that gets really messy, right? Because I mean, if you gathered a room of here's all the religions kind of idea of what Jesus is, and you actually put those people in a room, that would be a really diverse, group of people that we're trying to get from one person. So, I mean, Jesus is a real battleground for sure.
I love conservative American Jesus. He's pretty cool.
He's interesting. He's the gun thing is always interesting to me. The Jesus, with the guns like this that I see pictures of. All right, so we'll do politics for a second here. We won't do it too much. And, on this podcast, we'll never really like go into our political candidates or anything like that. We're just talking about numbers here. So everybody's safe here.
It would violate our 501c3 anyway.
Yes. So we're not going to talk about, who we voted for or how you should vote or anything like that. We're just going to discuss the numbers here. So politics really affects religion by the 1990s. So young liberal Christians break away from Christianity in the 1990s after observing kind of the powerful role that Christianity played in conservative politics. So what happens is in the 1960s, there's this kind of rise of secular culture, Roe versus Wade, no-fault divorce laws, sexual revolution, all the 60s stuff. And Christianity felt really threatened. And so what it did is because it felt threatened, they said, we need to become more politically powerful because we are losing, right? This scary secular 60s psychedelic sexual whatever culture, it does not represent us. And so we need to become powerful politically. And so the Republican Party kind of welcomed this white, wealthy, conservative Christian group as its base. And within a decade, the religious right became the major fundraisers for the Republican Party. And you can see this in movies like, I just watched The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Have you watched that one?
Mm.
Tammy Faye. Anyway, it's talking about how, these really big, big church kind of people were really involved into politics and really pouring a lot of money into politics. And so then by 1980, the Republican platform really wanted to represent conservative Christian views on, sex, families, abortion, school prayer, evolution, other issues where Christians had a dog in the fight. And it wasn't like that in the 50s. It wasn't like that before Christianity felt really threatened from the 1960s. And then another thing that happened with the shift is after 9/11, like I said, the enemy wasn't godless communists, it was religious radicals. So nuns could come out of the closet without sounding like Soviets. So, during the Cold War, if you came out as an atheist, it would be threatening to your career. It would be threatening because the enemy are godless Soviets, right? And so we could come out and say that. And so then what happens is one of the reasons for religious decline and one of the reasons that Gen Z, especially liberal Gen Z, is just resistant to religion is because of this allergic reaction to the religious right. The mixture of politics and Christianity threatened kind of the long-term sustainability of Christianity, because are you about Jesus or are you about winning this political battle? And it's Gen Z who's really watching that and saying, if this is religion, if your gun Jesus and all of this is religion, I don't want any part of religion. So they did get more powerful. Christianity did get more powerful, but they paid a cost for it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch presidential elections going forward. Up until now, it has been crucial that every candidate running for office claims some sort of religious belief, right? And yet we're becoming a nation that is making more and more space for people to not believe. And whereas in the past, admitting that you were an atheist would be kryptonite to a political campaign, the day is coming when, again, maybe it's not the next election, maybe it's not 3 or 4 elections, but at some point, folks who really don't care about the church and maybe even a significant number of atheists will make up the majority of people who go into the voting booth.
That is one of the most interesting thing about American politics. We'll never get this. We'll never get the numbers, but it would be so interesting if you could run like a secret poll on how many top elected officials don't believe in God, that aren't open about it. And isn't that interesting that you still have to play that game in order to play in politics? I don't know if in our lifetime we'll have like an atheist or a nun president. I don't know if that'll happen in our lifetime, because literally every question at press conferences would be like, how do you have any sense of morality if you don't believe in a higher power? That would be every question. And you'd spend so much time having to explain that, or she would have so much time having to explain that. Whereas Trump just gets to do, whatever he wants, and then just holds the Bible and takes a picture and has a base, right? So anyway, it was a tactic by Christianity when they felt threatened after the 60s, but they're paying for they're paying a cost, especially with the youth, for getting in bed with politics, essentially. And so we'll see if that backfires for them. We'll see if they react to that, and nobody really knows what's going to happen with that. How they're going to continue to be politically powerful in the United States.
Love it. Great stuff.
Okay, so the next one, I think you mentioned this before, that Gen Z has a mistrust of institutions, a distrust of authority. So this group has a significant trust issues when it comes to formal religious institutions. When asked to rate their trust of organized religion on a 10-point scale, 63% of young people answered 5 or below, including those who are affiliated with a religious tradition. So that number is including those who go to church. So most are distrusting of organized religion. And that is a new number. We've never had that much distrust in organized religion. In the past, that would be who you would trust. You would trust your pastor or your bishop or your whatever. And so that is a big shift, this distrust of authority.
I'm just sitting and thinking about like degrees of transparency. For instance, I look at the top there and I see, nonprofit organizations, and I get there's probably 1,000 other things that were voted on besides just these 10 or whatever it is, 8 things. But in my mind, the younger generation is paying particular attention to things like transparency, and they want more transparency. And so certain kinds of organizations, such as a nonprofit, has to be transparent. If you request the financials of a nonprofit, they have to give them to you. For instance, our nonprofit here, Mormon Discussion Incorporated, we post our financials on our website. Same kind of thing with banks, right? Banks are a little more transparent. They're FDIC insured. There's kind of a sense that that money's safe there, at least to some degree. You get told up front what your interest rate's going to be. But you work your way down and you can see that the lack of transparency is a big part of that loss of trust.
Yeah, so you see at the bottom of the list, even the medical system, they understand there's like HIPAA, there's HIPAA rules, there's protections. But with organized religions, they know that the first thing that they'll do is protect kind of the brand. They'll protect the name and not, the sexual abuse addict. And then even lower than religion is stuff like Congress. Like they know that politicians are lying and that they're trying to get votes and that they placate and that they say things that they don't really mean and that they have less power to pass legislation than they say to do when they're running. They know that. They get that.
They favor their district with pork barrel, addendums to laws and things like that.
At the bottom, media, Congress, big business, presidency. So they know that it's not the whole truth because they have the record of it, right? They can see it. They can go on TikTok and of any political candidate. You can do this with Obama. You can do this with anyone. We'll say something here and then kind of say something else over here. And you can splice them together and you can watch it in a 30-second video. So they know, they know. You can't hide that from them. All right, so let's talk about COVID and what that did. So we're still getting reports back from how COVID affected religion. We'll have a better view of that, obviously a decade from now. But the first reports that are coming back, and this is from Pew Research, not the Barna group that I was talking about before. So from Pew Research, it says that 3 in 10 adults say that the outbreak boosted their faith, which is the highest of any industrialized nation, with 4 in 10 saying that it tightened family bonds. So it's very common in times of calamity, in times of trial, that there's always an uptick of religious observance, right? Remembering family, remembering beliefs, remembering what's important. There'll be kind of an uptick of religious observance. And then it'll go back down. So for example, after 9/11, there was a surge in places of worship being filled to capacity, right? And then a year later, it had gone back down to where it was before. But the different thing about this that makes COVID unique is that in other times where even if there's a plague, or even if there's 9/11 or a war, you gather as a community and you go to church. But because COVID, we couldn't do that. Because the church is shut down, it had a different effect. So the early surveys are showing that this increased Gen Z leaving the pews, going to churches that have, a brick and mortar church house, because that was 2 years where they didn't have to go if their parents were forcing them to go, essentially. And so the statistic is going to be a little bit different than other plagues or other kind of times that we've had where everybody gathers together as a family and extended family in church, because we had to isolate. And in that isolation time, many young people began to realize, I haven't gone to church for a year. I'm still doing okay. Maybe I won't, go back if they were attending before. So I think it's actually going to increase Gen Z leaving organized religion, pew-based religion, because they had a pretty big block of time where they weren't able to go, where they weren't doing that.
Yeah, the faith that you and I come from, it feels like we are in a moment where they're panicking over the lack of missionaries, for instance, which has been a big deal over the last month or two in terms of how our old system's religious leaders are approaching it. And not necessarily all religions. Again, we came from one that was, I would label as a high demand fundamentalist religion. Not all of them are putting strains on people to the degree of the one that we came from. But in regards to ours and other high demand fundamentalist religions, you often are having so many responsibilities put on you, so many things to do, that you don't really have time to think through whether you really believe it, what the church tells you, whether you really want to stand for the things the church stands for. And having that time away allows you not only to go like, oh, I guess I'm okay without it, but it also allows you for the first time to not have this constant busy work. And you can begin to think. You have hours every day to kind of think through what's working and what's not working in your life. I'm sure there were folks who read books and left because they read too much history, essentially, right? They read too much data. There's probably people who left because they didn't feel the weight on their shoulders of shame and guilt. There's probably people who left because they realized that their time was of more value and that so much of it had been absorbed by the religious institution. There's probably 100 reasons.
Yeah. The mind-blowing statistic for me was that, and this is kind of separate from Gen Z, this is looking at the difference between men and women who are adults, is that what you're saying really rang true, especially for women. So women, when asked, do you miss going to church? Women, sometimes even privately, because they still believed or whatever, privately admitted, in these surveys, that it was such a relief to not have to wake up on Sunday and pack the toddler bag and print the lesson and make up the sign-up sheets. And there's a lot of unpaid, unnoticed labor that goes on, particularly on the backs of women. And that when they could just sit with their family on Sunday and just watch a movie and read a book and talk and whatever, without that huge responsibility, they reported that they didn't miss church and they loved on Sunday having the opportunity to fill their own spiritual cups. The fascinating thing is that men did not say the same thing. The men reported that they missed the social interaction. So what that tells me about religion, organized religion specifically, is that a lot of it is built to give men the social interaction that they need that isn't out there in society. So it may be true that for a lot of men, maybe even most men, the circle that you have, as men, second hour of church, where you talk about things, that may be the only socially acceptable place where you talk about how to be a better dad, how to be a better husband, to cry without being ashamed, to talk about what you believe, to talk about your doubts. And it really may be that the entire institution is unpaid labor by women to give men the social outlets that they need that they aren't getting in society. And so what happened when COVID happened is that the women reported it was so nice to not have to do all the sign up sheets and the meetings and and all the thing and packing the bags and do the kids have snacks and dressing the kids for church. It was such a relief to not have to do that. But the men and the women can have lunch dates with other girlfriends or have group texts and talk about their marriage, and they can replace the social aspect. But the men couldn't. The men didn't. And they missed church really because they missed the social life of having other men around them, and they didn't replace that. And so that tells me a lot.
And it should be noted too that Christian religious text, and at least to some degree, a portion of Christian religious theology, is very much patriarchy, right? Very much like women are objects, women, are to be silent, women are to do this, women are to do that. Here's what men's roles are. And so I can imagine too, because of that men missed church maybe a little more than women because it held up those ideals and
Because
allowed
they're
them more
really
privilege.
valued, right? They get a lot of social things that they don't get in society. But then also, like what you're saying, you get to stand up in a meeting and your word is gospel. You get to
Yeah.
have people come to you asking your advice, and you feel good that you did something for someone else.
And I
There
show
are
up at church, and the message is that the wife is to support the husband and to essentially let him preside and be obedient to him as he's obedient to God.
Right. And so the men are just getting these huge kind of social and ego and
Yeah.
meaning and purpose benefits that when we looked at COVID, they missed that. They didn't replace that. And the women finally were able to take a breath and fill their own spiritual cup. And then a lot of the women just didn't want to go back. So that was super, super interesting to watch.
Love it.
Yeah, as far as the kids, COVID affected family ties. The youth, even though they got used to not going to church, if they were going to church, they did say that it increased their family bonds. So there was that. There was this was percent who say their relationship with immediate family members became stronger as a result of COVID. And so the family bonds did get stronger, but not in the sense of we go as a family and go to church, which is what happened after 9/11, which is what happened when there were other kind of plagues and whatever going on in the world. So the family bonds increased, but the religiosity did not.
Yeah, I think being stuck in your house for some of that time, it was it was counseled against, encouraged not to, taboo to go out and to be part of the larger society. So by being home, you're certainly more board games were played, more activities in the house where you got the family together and did something. Maybe you had a movie night, whatever it was.
Yeah, I would say for me, I think our family bonds did increase, but I would also say that I took for granted kind of societal supports that helped me be a mom. So when I lost school and I lost the McDonald's playland and I lost the trampoline park and I lost, park dates with friends and going to the YMCA, and when I began to realize that, raising a family, there were a lot of kind of community supports in order to help me be able to parent. And when I lost those, that was hard. That was really, really hard. And it's really interesting that during that time, mothers, especially mothers of young children, went a little bit crazy because, you didn't have some of those social supports that you used to. And so I remember going to an LDS church parking lot, and we all sat in our trunk because it was when, we really needed to isolate. So we sat in our trunk and it was in a circle. And these were active LDS women. And we started passing around gummies that came from Oregon, let's say. I live in Idaho, okay? And these were active women, but everybody had lost their minds to such an extent that it was like, if I don't go and see another adult and do something to bring my anxiety down, I'm going to shoot somebody. And so it was the first time I got to sit around with, active LDS women who I was friends with. And and experience some anti-anxiety time. And so I do think it increased family bonds, but I do think that mothers took on a lot during that time and really got burned out during that time too.
Just to say too, I didn't experience this, and obviously you're talking about the women's side of it, but I'm just talking about COVID, and here's why. I worked for a pawn shop, which lends out money, and like the rest of the banking industry, we got the exception, essentially exemption. So we continued running business as usual, and so I wasn't at home. I think there was a week or two where at the very beginning everybody kind of had to close for a few days, but outside of that, like, we kept doing business. So I didn't, like, as you're sharing,
and you kept podcasting, which is your other,
but you're sharing this anxiety felt, and being unable to go out into public, unable to do the normal rituals of your life, is certainly, that makes perfect sense that it would add some serious anxiety to people and some serious negative emotions.
All right, so the next slide here is Gen Z rejects that there's one way, and that they also report that religion is not important. So Gen Z has rejected the way religion has sought to shape their forms of gender and sexual identity and expression. If the religion of their parents tells them that there's a certain right way to be a woman or a sexual person, they reject this one right way. They just see too many people flourishing in their lives in different ways that they just can't buy that anymore. And so it's interesting watching the churches like the one we came from, where the bread and butter is this is the one true way. There are other churches that also claim that too. It's interesting to see how they're faring when Gen Z wants no part of that narrative. They just don't believe it at all. And so, and then also they're reporting that while their parents say that religion is important, there was this study where they did parents and teens, and 43% of the parents said that religion was really important. But the teens of those parents, only 25% of those teens said that religion was important. And so it's just not as important to them as it is for their parents.
Yeah, the one in the top left corner there, 52% of affiliated young people have little to no trust in organized religion. That seems so significant, that more than half the population of that group has little, almost nothing, or no trust in institutional religion.
And a third attend religious services once a year or less. So that's even like, going to a mass on Christmas, like
C&E.
We're barely even getting that.
Yeah.
All right. And then rituals here. So they do not rely on tradition for rituals. So even though 75% of Gen Z said they had a religious background, there was a religion present in the home, only 18% said that they planned to observe formal traditions at their wedding. So 87% saw themselves making their own traditions. They don't need to go to the church in order to validate their a birth, a religion. And that's really different from times in the past. The parents and grandparents, even if you were atheist, even if you didn't believe, when it was time to get married, you went to the church. Like that's just what you do. You still show up at the church. And we're seeing with this generation that even those that were raised in a particular religious kind of background, they don't go to the church for a wedding. They want to do their own wedding. They want to plan it themselves. They want to write their own rituals, right? And that's really different than even unbelievers, even nuns in previous generations.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next 20 years of the religions that deeply soften up and go like, no, like let's make room that people can do things kind of their own way. And the religions that want to hold on to some of it and say, nope, this is the one way. This is the way, the truth, the light. This is the only true path that gets you back to God. All the rituals have to be done exactly this way. We have to be exclusionary in these sorts of ways. And it's going to be interesting to see in a couple of decades if those kinds of churches do better than the ones who make space for nuance and adaptability and people to do things kind of to the beat of their own drum.
Yeah, the tension here is that as a church, like if you were a pastor of a certain church, the people paying tithing and showing up and being really dedicated are the older generation. And so if you completely cut off that narrative to serve Gen Z, you're going to cut off your rich, powerful, devout base. And so it's this, I see churches and I see pastors do this. They start adding like, oh, it's youth Zoom time or whatever. They're trying to do things for the youth, but they're definitely not wanting to go fast enough to kind of offend the base. And they're stuck in between these two really different generations
Yeah.
who have different needs, who have different spiritual needs, have different ways of looking at the world. And so what do? Do you throw your money into the future, but then for a while it's going to be super unsteady and you're going to lose your base and you're going to lose your money and you're going to lose all your devout members? Or do you kind of hold to that group and just kind of throw these little nuggets at Gen Z, which is usually what I see, because they're really stuck between two really different generations, and that would be really hard to figure out how to navigate through that.
If you don't cater to the younger generation, every church is a generation or two away from dying, right? So if we allow the tithe payers,
Yeah.
the older generation, to feel supported, and in the meantime, 80% of the younger generation vanishes from church, now you've got nothing in 20 years,
Yeah.
And
In the past, though, they could do that slowly. They could like
yeah,
make that transition and like slowly Christianity began to will change some things or whatever. But they've never had to do it. Any religion has never had to like literally turn on a dime and change that quickly. They've never
yeah.
had to. And you can see why they're struggling with it. They've never had to placate these two generations that are this far apart.
Yeah, and you're seeing maybe again in the system we came from, one thing I think they're trying to do is they're teaching a very different theology and curriculum to the younger generation and allowing the older generation to hang on to the old stuff. And so
Mm,
essentially it's two different theologies, two different sets of doctrine, two
mm,
different approaches to religion, and they're not
yeah,
overlapping exactly.
you're totally right. It's bringing in the new without denouncing the old to try to placate both. And so
Yeah.
you do have these competing theologies, and kids in seminary are getting different things. But the old seminary manual was never like, hey, we're not doing this anymore. It just kind of like quietly disappears, right?
But that may backfire too, because then you end up with more disagreement in the home between parents and children as one generation goes, no, of course we believe the earth is this, or this
Mm,
is what we have to do, or this is how these doctrines work. And the younger generation's like, no, they just taught me this week that it's the exact opposite of what you've said.
hmm.
So that may not work out well either.
It's tough. I can be empathetic that that would be a hard place to be in if you really are a pastor and you really believe and you want to, be like Jesus and try to serve a religious community. That would be really difficult. Here's a quote from, I read a book as part of this, part of studying Gen Z. It was called Gen Z Curriculum of Discipleship. And it was a book that was published to give to churches to try to help them with their Gen Z problem, essentially. And so here's a quote that just like, this is just so typical of one way that churches are responding to this. So, quote, this is from Judy Tadros, who wrote this book that's very popular in Christian churches trying to figure out Gen Z and how to disciple to them. So the quote says, what distinguishes pastors is that God commissions them to teach his truth to his people, the church. They are the voice of absolute truth in a world that is contrary to it. Gen Z is a generation living in a world that pushes God away, making them think that God is an option rather than the only way, the truth, and the life. It is for this reason the church, especially pastors and teachers of the word of God, are key in denouncing these heretic beliefs in a world going further away from the biblical truth of Jesus Christ. This is literally in a book that is for, like, no sarcasm, in a book that is for pastors on how to deal with Gen Z. And it's basically that they're falling away from God, which isn't even true. They're just leaving church, right? As we talked about.
Yeah.
And that you have the voice of God, you have the truth, you have the absolute truth, and the world is falling away and pulling them away, and Satan's pulling them away, and you have to save them and you have to bring them back into this order that's the only way. And you can see that that entire message is not going to resonate with Gen Z at
Yeah.
all.
It's not
But
going to
it's
work.
what they're trying to do, because that is the tool that they've always used, that the world is bad and you're safe here and this is the way and this is the path. And so they're still trying to do that, and it's not going well. It's not going well for them.
Yeah, but that's what happens when institutions feel threatened. As you pointed out, two things could happen, and one of them is you entrench harder. You push back harder against this lost and fallen world, and these kids already are picking up on that doesn't hold up. So you just create a larger divide, more tension.
Especially when they see, and this was another big one, I don't think I put this in here, but when moral leaders are no longer the people of the church, because if they see that people outside the church are fighting for people to have more rights if they're LGBTQ, and the church is not, or even that their church is fighting against that, the church is no longer their moral authority. The church is no longer giving them a moral education. They're getting that they feel outside of church. And so that becomes a problem too.
Love it.
All right. So loneliness. This is the problem with Gen Z, is that they're in need of leadership. So even though they're not turning to churches as often, and that number is only increasing, young people still need adults in their lives to guide them during challenging and uncertain times. So an interesting statistic is that 24% of young people say that they never feel that their life has meaning and purpose. So that's a quarter of young people. But with just one adult mentor, that number dropped to 6%. And so a similar trend for loneliness. 58% of those with no adult mentors say that they sometimes have someone to talk to, but that number drops again to 48% with just one adult mentor. And so the disconnect, the hard thing for this generation is that as they're distrusting organized religion, and rightly so, there's a lot of things to distrust. The problem is, how are they getting adult mentors they can trust? Where can they show up to be part of something where an adult has a job to keep an eye on them, to give them advice, to check on them, to say, how are you doing? They don't have that right now.
Right.
And so if you know, and we've talked about this before as far as, okay, where is this going? One of the problems with where this is going is that Gen Z is incredibly lonely, in need of adult mentors, and there's no societal place to provide that for them. And so how do we deal with that?
Where are youth groups in the secular world? And even
That's
the
the missing
organizations,
piece.
even the organizations that attempt to do that, the Boy Scouts has its own ethical issues that it's run into. There just really isn't a lot of these kinds of spaces. And so you're really talking about it. Does school fill that, right? Does school groups and sports teams and clubs and things in school have to kind of pick up the slack? Or we have to create, as we've been talking about for months, have to create something new to replace it?
Yeah, there's just no place where they're getting adult mentorship. And
Right.
it's something that I'm aware of as I'm trying to raise my kids in this. Is one of the reasons that I have my kids in karate is because they're these really cool teachers that teach them about, personal responsibility and, morals, and be like Bruce Lee and all these cool things, right? And I literally am paying. So it may be because we've deconstructed, there may never be like a one-stop shop anymore for you to get all the benefits that religion used to provide. But as people are piecing it together, people who teach karate, but with morality, we're going to pay that person to do that, to fill in that hole, right? And so it may be that we do this in a deconstructed way, but we at least need to recognize that Gen Z doesn't have adult mentors. And maybe the future is we start paying people to do that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Therapy is also, they're more open to therapy. So they at least will have hope, there's not the mental stigma with therapists. That's one piece in place, hopefully for them.
Yeah, the only reason I'm hesitating is because we have a problem in this space that when we allow people to kind of self-select themselves to help out children and youth, what you end up with is the really unhealthy individuals of that society tend to find them who have unhealthy behaviors towards children, pedophilia, that kind of thing. Those people tend to gravitate towards those types of places because that's a safe space where they get to interact with children. And so as we create new kinds of groups that allow adults to mentor to the youth, I think I'm just in the back of my head going, we still have to figure out a way so that we don't end up with the same thing that happened in Catholicism, but now it just happens in a secular group. Like we still have to solve problems.
Yeah, totally. And so you'll see that states are doing this where if you work with youth, you have to pass this back. And it doesn't weed out everyone, but it's
Yeah.
at least something, And so, maybe that gets filled by other areas of society, but you're right, it is going to be different because when I take my kid to karate, I'm there and I'm signing up for it and I consent to it and my kid consents to it. But I'm never, like, I don't leave them. It's not one-on-one in like a private karate studio and I just drop them off and leave, right? It's safer. So maybe those things will have to change because we are so much more aware now of child predators and how they can thrive in certain organizations. So yeah, it may be deconstructed. It may look different for each family because we just don't have the one-stop shop religions anymore, but they need adult mentors. And so if you're listening and you have teens, are they hearing the morals that you teach from other adults that are not you, and how can you access that? I don't have the answer to it, but at least we can ask the question and start trying to piece that together.
So.
All right, so I think that's the end of the slides that I have, but I have a couple more things about Gen Z, and then we'll wrap up here. Although they do have some problems, loneliness, isolation, need of mentorships, there are 4 major values where they're leading the way. And I always want to do this because so often when we talk about the youth, we talk about that they're online too much. And it's, we talk about their problems, but there's 4 things that they are leading the way on that we just need to recognize. So that one is obviously diversity. When it comes to who sits with, the marginalized, the outcasts, the sex workers, the second-class citizens, as Jesus did, it's Gen Z that's leading the way. They're the ones that are most likely to be the Good Samaritan. And so it makes me so sad when I read paragraphs like the one that I just read to you, where the lady's like, you got to get them on the Bible and the absolute truth.
Hammer it
and blah, blah,
harder.
blah. Yeah, hammer it harder, without realizing, no, in this scenario, they are the Good Samaritan. They are more likely than any of us to stop and hear someone else's story, to stop and hear and stand up against injustice. And so whenever we talk to youth as if they're lost, when they're leading the way in something, there's going to be a disconnect. They're not going to feel loved and valued because you're telling them that this is the way without recognizing, hey, you guys do this really well. Like, why don't you lead this discussion on diversity? Why don't you tell me the story of the Good Samaritan and a time that you've had that in your life rather than me tell it at you, right? Because they're leading the way there. Openness. Gen Z does not debate Bible verses or lose their faith doing deep dives into philosophy and theology. They don't have the same theological baggage as their parents. They are open to redefining Christianity and religion without requiring a lot of work to get there. So because they are so open, if the churches do decide to make big shifts, they're on board with that. They're not stuck on any particular, verse that has to be the way that it is. And so that is one opportunity, is that if churches did decide that we really want to pivot in order to be relevant to the next generation, Gen Z is open to that because they don't have the same theology background as their parents and grandparents, where it's like, we can't do that because of this verse. They're not going to do that. Oh, you're muted, Bill.
I was going to say whatever the data bears out, right? Like they're not forced into these pigeonholes of going like, oh, my church says that this is the way it has to be. And even though I feel this internal tension that what they're doing isn't right, old generations would just go like, I'm just to go along with that. Like my job is not to question. This is how we do things. They must be right. I must be wrong about my feelings. And this younger generation goes like, no, this internal conversation going on inside. I trust that. I trust that I've worked out the right way to treat a human being, regardless of what my religious institution says. To the extent, again, not to go back to ours, but in our religious system, they still have this old way of doing things, for instance, with people of color. And then in the modern moment, they're trying to pretend like they've always been on board. Like we are the ones who do this thing right. And they don't really want to have a conversation about it. And I think the kids kind of sense like, man, you guys were really unhealthy back then, and you really haven't solved the problem yet. And I just don't again, goes back to trust. They just don't trust these institutions because they've been let down. They've seen how this is all played out, and they've figured out by this point that their inner gut gives them better answers than trusting these systems.
Yeah, they're getting a lot more information on TikTok. I mean, than we ever did. I mean, we had to read books and really dive into these rabbit holes, and they just get, they'll get a leader that says something, and then 50 years later it's the opposite, and it just pops up on TikTok for 10 seconds and they get it. They didn't have to do the historical work to get there like we used to have to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was 20 years ago, I mean, there were times I was reading microfilms to try to like make sense of polygamy. Like if you want to go into like ex-Mormon, TikTok, Reddit, within 2 minutes, you can get a lot of information. And I was, hours in the library trying to find it. And so it's just they're much more open because they just have more information than we ever did. The other one is empathy. So empathy is sometimes viewed from older adults as being overly sensitive, politically correct, snowflakes, but but treading lightly on people's experiences, giving space for other spiritual journeys, being compassionate. They're really leading the way in empathy, which we should value. We should, instead of always talking about they need to change and why do they do this and that, value that they're leading the way in empathy. And the last one is relationships, which you've talked about. While some churches may say people over principle, it is Gen Z that most lives by it and recognizes when the church actually doesn't. So if the church says we stand for the marginalized, we're going to be like Jesus, and we and then the sex scandal comes out and it was very clear that you didn't, they are the most tuned in to recognize that, right? So Gen Z values authenticity, vulnerability, and true connection over slick marketing, overly structured programming, lawyers also. They won't be drawn into churches by graphic design, lighting, set production, or even by a young hip pastor. Like most everyone, they will come into the church. They will come to a church where they have been invited by friends, where there are people that look like them on the stage and in the staff, and that their doctrine and religious rules won't mean anything to them if it excludes their friends, especially those in the LGBTQ community. It's just a no-go. If I don't see people that look like me, if I don't see diversity, if I don't see, if you talk about loving others, but your doctrine is hurting my LGBTQ self or friends, it's just not going to go. I'm not playing this game.
It's a tall order for them, meaning the churches, to come up with a religious approach that is internally coherent, that meshes and doesn't seem like they're talking out both sides of their mouth.
Yeah. So the last thing, and this surprised me, like some of this, you and I have been, having conversations like this for long enough, we can kind of intuit some of these statistics. This one surprised me. It's shocking to me, and I think parents really need to understand this. Parents need to know how much of kids' spirituality these days is being led by TikTok tarot readers. I think we underestimate how much the young people and the kids are getting their spirituality from that source. And because, parents and grandparents, they're not on TikTok, they may not fully understand what they're even watching on TikTok or what TikTok is. I think we need to realize, so the recent data shows that 51% of young people engage in tarot cards or other fortune telling practices. Divination practices are even popular. So 78% of Mormon youth will
Mm.
follow and engage with some kind of tarot, fortune telling, horoscope, something. For atheist kids, it is the lowest. But so the interesting thing is, if you are in a high demand fundamentalist religion that feels really suffocating, what we're seeing is the outlet for that is tarot, occult, divination. If you want to hear Bill and I talk about that, we did a whole episode on that you can go back and listen to. And that they are getting that specifically on social media, and that they follow that and they play with that and they're interested in that and they're curious about it and they spend a lot of time there. And I think we're underestimating that is where they're getting a lot of their spirituality.
Man, I'm just looking at that. That does surprise me. Again, it was what, Russian Greek Orthodox 78.1, Mormon 69.4, Jewish 62.1. I would have never expected those things to be as high as they are. And we came from, again, Mormon, we came from this system that in the 1980s, 1990s very clearly spoke out against these things. But the materials that did that have been done away with, and it would be hard pressed today. Again, the more rigid the church gets, the more likely it is to lose this younger generation. It'll be interesting to see how these religions respond to those kinds of statistics.
Yeah. So from this study, some responses that showed up is that this 16-year-old wrote, "Our generation has already been distancing ourselves from institutions. The main three Abrahamic religions leave little to our own interpretation of scripture." So, right.
Yeah.
So because authenticity is so important, they have to have room to kind of find their own and interpret their own spiritual path. That's very important to them. And so
Mm.
it's continuing the quote, "With tarot and similar practices, we're open to interpret what we want to think for ourselves and make our own guidelines when it comes to spirituality," which is why I think a lot of people resonate with it. So if you're not getting the flexibility at church and the parents and grandparents and the one true way and all of that, where that shows up is, wow, I really like playing with tarot cards because I get to interpret what this means for my life. And they never have had that much freedom and given permission to do that. So another response, 22-year-old, "I think crystals are like saints for young people and spirituals. Sometimes you just need something or someone that is rooted in courage." And so they don't have like solid beliefs about how tarot really interacts with planets and all of that. I don't think it's super sophisticated because they are young. We're talking about teens, but it's kind of like their saints or their scripture reading because they get to kind of interpret what they want. They get to check in with their inner self and kind of feel around there. And then for the crystals, a lot of them don't know if it's real or not, or how it's real, or be able to explain that scientifically. But I'm going to hold this, and this is my gratitude crystal. That's the same thing as having a saint of gratitude or a saint of this or a saint of that,
Right.
right? And so
Yeah.
that's how they're getting that. And so it's super interesting to see that in the longer history of Christianity, whenever Christianity got too rigid, paganism would have a big rise, and then Christianity would steal the cool things going on in paganism, and it would go down and become more flexible, and then it would get kind of ossified again, and then paganism would come up. And so we're seeing a huge rise in the occult, in tarot, in horoscopes, in new paganism, in earthy kind of doing drums in a full moon and that kind of spirituality. We're seeing a huge surge of that, bigger than I was really intuiting.
Yeah. And what I notice in this section is there is this wrestle between inner authority and outer authority. And when you use crystals, when you're, like you said, when these quotes point to people want to have a tool that they can listen to their own inner voice, rather than, as the one guy said, the main three Abrahamic religions leave little to our own interpretation of Scripture. These kids do not want it imposed on them, things that feel contrary, and the things they don't agree with that are going on inside of them.
It's the interesting thing when you take that bird's eye view and get to see, oh, people aren't getting this, and then you'll see kind of the transition to where they get it somewhere else, right? If you do that in Christianity, you can see that over time. And so whenever things, get too structured, too ordered, there'll just be a rise of the pagan and the earth and the personal revelation and the personal intuitions. So all of that is on the rise, kind of as this pendulum swing always goes back and forth. But the interesting thing is, so only 1 million US adults identify as like pagan or Wiccan. But the shocking statistic for me was 6 in 10 Americans ascribe to at least one New Age belief. So this would be astrology, psychics, crystals, spiritual energy, whatnot. So 6 in 10 Americans ascribe to at least one of those. And so we're seeing that because religions didn't give the flexibility and the earth and the carving your own path and what does your intuition say, basically there's this surge to reject religion and go over to these kind of New Age beliefs, which are all about that.
Yeah, no, good stuff. I'm just sitting here thinking about like the idea that 60% have some New Age belief, and if that many people are experiencing those things, they're also feeling something from that, right? Like, it's not like it's a one and done. That statistic is too high. There's some consistency there. So religion comes along and says, we have the real magic, and you have spiritual experiences within those constructs. And now 60% of these folks are in some other construct, and they're still having experiences. And what that's going to do is, again, open them up even more to go, I don't need to be in a particular place to have spiritual experiences. They can be accessed in a whole multitude of ways. It's got nothing to do with whether something's true or false. You and I are both very skeptical of these New Age practices as well. Whether they are literally the real magic doesn't matter. To some degree, they work nonetheless.
Yeah, they work because your intuition it can be a conversation with your subconscious, and that can be very enlightening. The interesting thing is that big business has taken notice of this. So places like Urban Outfitters, you can buy crystals and tarot cards and ritual kits where you sage your house, and you have like Gwyneth Paltrow who will like tell you to put jade up your vagina and sell you water bottles that have amethyst in them and all of that. And just tons
you must have seen my candle collection.
Oh my gosh. Anyway. And influencers who will read tarot on Instagram that just have thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers. But the interesting thing is it's not really gathered, right? So only 1 million adults identify as pagan or Wiccan and go to kind of like witch gatherings. And so this is being done individually. And so I wonder, as the pendulum is swinging from organized religion to this kind of individual, because we just had a need for individuals who weren't being seen. I wonder if, after 100 years of everybody doing sage by themselves or crystals by themselves, I wonder if that will start to, or you get lonely. You want to do this with other people. I wonder if it'll swing towards some of those things being more organized, whereas right now it's really not organized. It's something that's happening, especially with kids on social media by themselves, but they're not gathering in groups, which is interesting. Maybe that will come as the pendulum swings back.
And if you do that, you start to get in groups. All of a sudden somebody has to be in charge maybe, and then you end up maybe with more gurus, and there's all kinds of unhealthiness that can come from that path as well.
Yeah, well, we'll watch it as it goes. And then the last thing I have is that Gen Z is interested in political causes. A lot of them say that they really experience Christianity or spirituality with political causes. So they're at the forefront of things like Black Lives Matter or human rights, gun control, environmental protection. And to them, social justice and equality is more than just catchphrases. It is a sense their spirituality. So more than half of Gen Zers have engaged in acts of protest as a religious or spiritual practice. So I think we also have to recognize that some older generation like to just call Gen Z your snowflakes, and you're getting involved in politics because you're offended at everything and you're being politically correct. What we don't realize often is that this is how they're showing up spiritually. This is how they're showing up in community with others on behalf of something that's bigger than them. And so many, if Christian churches, of course, now they really can't because they got in bed with right politics. But if Gen Z, had a church where the pastor went with them to political causes that they cared about that seemed to be in line with Jesus and New Testament, that is really where they're showing up. But the pastors can't go there because of the power of the Christian right and how many people they would lose if they showed up to something like Black Lives Matter. And so again, it's like this split. What does the pastor do when it becomes so political in your religious community, where the Gen Zers are very religious and spiritual about showing up with political causes, but then of course the Christian right is so powerful and it has its own narrative. Now they're at odds with each other.
Good stuff.
All right. So I think that's it for me. So what does Gen Z do as they become adults? So what does the future of religion look like just based on looking at this generation? So the future has the occult, new age stuff, new paganism, political movements, distrust of institutions. The belief in the higher power and God is still active. They're not majority atheists. They lack trustworthy adults as mentors, and they have anxiety about the future of our world and humanity. And so it'll be really interesting to see. All estimations show that, within the next 20, 40, 50 years, religion, in order to survive, is going to have to make some big changes. And you and I will be here for as long as we're here talking about it.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. All right. And then last thing that I wanted to say, Bill and I do like to listen to podcasts in order to prepare for certain things, but there is no other person that went through the data that we just did. And so, if we had an exclusive channel, that would have been exclusive content. So if that was interesting to you, that really is, this is material that I haven't seen anyone else do the way that we just did. So if that was interesting and helpful for you, especially if you're a parent of Gen Zers, toss us a couple bucks so we can keep finding content that is relevant that you can't find anywhere else.
Yeah. And I'll just say, Britt put a lot of time into creating the PowerPoint, grabbing quotes, putting the commentary on each of these slides together. Folks, if you can, support the podcast, almostawakened.org, click the donate button. And as Britt's pointing out, send us a few bucks a month. Britt really is working hard to try to bring each of you content that helps you kind of navigate this second half of life as you've deconstructed religion. But as we try to talk about each week, find useful ways to still have the good things that religion brings us. And Britt, I think you're doing a fantastic job of it. So folks, please don't hesitate to support her and to support this work. Always
fun to chat, Bill. And this was the thing that I really wanted to research when I was in school. So I was so excited to share it with all of you. And I'm just really excited to see how much change can happen in the next 20 years. And hopefully as we continue to grow this podcast, we'll be able to be commentators for the entire ride.
Yeah. And I did put the PDF.
Yeah.
I did put the PDF of the PowerPoint. It'll be on every place where the podcast is available. So you can get it there, and I'll share the outline there too, so that folks can pull those quotes up in the different directions that you went in today. A lot of work went into this. We're going 2 hours in now, and just want to say thank you for all that you do.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. And thanks everybody for listening who went on this ride with us, and take care of yourselves. There's lots of planets in retrograde.
Hey, have a great day.
All right. Bye.
This has been another Almost Awakened episode. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation to keep this podcast running, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources shared in today's episode. For coaching opportunities or extra support, visit NoNonsenseSpirituality.com to meet with Certified Spiritual Director Brittany Hartley.